Kicked out by their family, an elderly couple bought an old cabin. What they found changed everything for 42 years. The house on Maple Ridge Road had been the center of George and Dorothy's world. It wasn't large, it wasn't grand, but every floorboard held memory. The oak tree in the front yard had been planted the day their first grandchild was born. The kitchen walls still carried faint pencil marks, measuring children who had long since grown taller than the doorframe. The porch swing creaked in a familiar rhythm, as if the house itself breathed with them. George used to say the house had good bones. Dorothy used to say love was what kept it standing. For decades, they lived simply. George worked 35 years at the same manufacturing plant, never late, never once written up. Dorothy worked part-time at the public library, then full-time as the grandchildren started arriving. She became the steady presence, the after-school snack maker, the homework helper, the emergency babysitter when parents ran late. They weren't wealthy, but they were needed, and that had always been enough. It began gradually. A tuition payment here, a co-signed loan there, a temporary transfer to help with rent. When their eldest grandson wanted to start a landscaping business, George dipped into his retirement savings without hesitation. "It's an investment in his future," he'd said. When their granddaughter needed help with medical bills after an uninsured procedure, Dorothy quietly signed over part of her inheritance. "Family shows up," she'd said, and they did, every time. Birthdays were celebrated in that kitchen. Thanksgiving dinners stretched long into the evening with laughter and stories. Christmas mornings were chaos and wrapping paper and children running down the hallway in pajamas. But slowly, almost invisibly, something shifted. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. The urgency in the grandchildren's voices only returned when something was needed. Another loan, another emergency, another promise to pay it back soon. George kept spreadsheets at first, neatly typed columns, due dates, amounts. After a while, he stopped updating them. Dorothy noticed. She never said anything. The final withdrawal happened on a Tuesday. George sat at the kitchen table staring at the bank statement. His retirement account, once the quiet comfort beneath everything, was nearly empty. Dorothy stood at the sink, drying the same plate for longer than necessary. "They'll be okay now," she said gently. "We helped them get started." George nodded. That night he tried calling their eldest grandson just to check in. No answer. He left a voicemail. No call back. Over the next few weeks, silence settled into the house like dust. Birthdays passed without visits. Sunday dinners stopped. When Dorothy texted photos of the garden blooming, the messages were marked "Read." No response. Then came the envelope. Certified mail. George recognized the return address immediately. The bank. He opened it slowly, methodically, as if delaying the inevitable might soften it. It didn't. Due to refinancing and accumulated debt, the home was now under review for foreclosure. Dorothy lowered herself into a chair. "But we refinanced to help them consolidate," she whispered. "They said it would be temporary." It had been temporary for them. The refinancing had shifted legal protections George barely understood at the time. In his effort to lower monthly payments and free up funds for the grandchildren, he had unknowingly placed the house at risk. The mortgage payments, stretched thin for years, were now impossible. George made the calls. He waited on hold. He explained. He negotiated. He pleaded. Deadlines were extended once. Then, not again. He tried calling the grandchildren. All of them. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. One number had been disconnected. Dorothy left messages anyway. "We just need to talk." No one came. The eviction notice arrived on a grey morning in late October. The wind carried leaves across the yard like restless thoughts. Dorothy folded the notice carefully after reading it. She smoothed the crease with trembling fingers, as though tidiness could restore control. "When?" she asked quietly. 30 days, George replied. Neither cried. Not then. Packing felt surreal. Every object carried weight. The wedding china, George's old work boots, photo albums thick with decades of birthdays and school plays. Dorothy found a drawing taped inside a cookbook, a crayon picture labeled Grandma's House in uneven handwriting. She pressed it to her chest before placing it in a box. Neighbors began to notice. Some offered awkward sympathy, some pretended not to look. Word travels quickly in small neighborhoods, and there is something about public loss that makes people uncomfortable. On the final day, a county truck pulled up. 2 workers stepped out, polite but distant. Procedure, not cruelty. George had already moved most of their belongings to the curb. What they couldn't take was marked for removal. Dorothy stood on the porch one last time. The oak tree rustled overhead. The porch swing swayed in the wind. For a moment, the silence felt louder than any argument ever could have. Across the street, a curtain shifted. Someone was watching. Someone always watches when dignity is being tested. A worker approached George with paperwork. "Sir, I'm sorry." George nodded once. "You're just doing your job." The door was locked behind them. Not slammed, just closed. 42 years reduced to a click. Dorothy's shoulders began to shake. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way grief escapes when it's been held too long. George stepped beside her. He didn't look back at the house. He looked at her. "We still have each other," he said softly. It wasn't denial, it wasn't defiance, it was fact. Dorothy exhaled slowly, steadying herself against him. "Yes," she said, "we do." That afternoon they sat in George's old pickup truck with what remained of their lives stacked behind them. A few boxes, a suitcase each, important documents, photo albums. Everything else stayed behind. George unfolded the local newspaper he'd picked up from the gas station that morning. He hadn't planned to read it. It had just been habit. Now, with nowhere immediate to go, he let his eyes drift across the classifieds. Estate sales, farm equipment auctions, foreclosures. One small listing caught his attention. County surplus auction, seized and condemned properties minimum bid. $50 property ID, Sawiga 47B, rural cabin structure. George frowned. Rural cabin. He read the fine print twice. Structure condemned, sold as is, no inspection guarantee. Dorothy noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" He handed her the paper. She scanned the listing. "It's probably falling apart," she said gently. "Maybe," George replied. They had just under $200 left in their checking account after paying final fees. $50 would leave them with almost nothing. Dorothy stared at the listing a long time. "We've rebuilt before," she said finally. "Remember when the basement flooded in '89? George almost smiled. They drove to the county office where the auction was being held in a small multi-purpose room with folding chairs and stale coffee. No one paid much attention to them. Why would they? 2 elderly strangers in worn clothes. The bidding moved quickly through farmland parcels and old storage units. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat. "Property ID number 47B, condemned cabin structure. Minimum bid $50. Silence. A few people flipped pages disinterestedly. George felt his pulse in his ears. Dorothy's hand found his. He raised his bidder card. 50. The auctioneer glanced around. $50. Do I hear 60? No one spoke. The pause stretched. George wondered if he was being foolish. He thought of the oak tree, of the empty voicemails, of the locked door. "Going once." Dorothy squeezed his hand tighter. "Going twice." For a split second, George imagined someone else raising a card, someone taking even this small chance away. Sold. The gavel struck wood. The sound echoed sharper than expected. It wasn't applause. It wasn't celebration. It was simply final. George exhaled slowly. Dorothy leaned into him. They had just purchased a condemned cabin, sight unseen, with nearly everything they had left. As they signed the paperwork, George skimmed the property description again. Parcel dimensions, structural instability, utilities disconnected. But one line stood out. Previous structural modifications noted. Documentation incomplete. George paused. "What does that mean?" Dorothy asked. He shook his head slightly. "Probably nothing," he said. But something about the wording lingered. Incomplete. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the sky had begun to clear. They didn't know what waited for them in that cabin. They didn't know how they would fix it. They didn't know how long their remaining money would last. All they knew was this: They were no longer needed, but they were not finished. And somewhere beyond the edge of town, in a patch of neglected land no one else wanted, a condemned structure sat quietly, holding a secret no one had thought to mention. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt road that barely deserved to be called a road at all. Tall pines crowded both sides, their branches leaning inward as if conspiring to hide whatever lay beyond. The truck tires crunched over gravel and fallen twigs as George eased forward, both hands steady on the wheel. When the trees finally opened, Dorothy's breath caught. The structure was worse than she'd imagined. The porch sagged dramatically on one side, boards splintered and grey with age. 2 windows were boarded shut. The roof dipped slightly in the middle like a tired back that had carried too much weight for too long. Weeds had swallowed what might once have been a yard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. This was it, their $50 future. George turned off the engine. Silence settled thick and complete, broken only by wind threading through the trees. Dorothy stepped out first. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. She walked slowly toward the porch, her shoes sinking slightly into soft ground. When she pressed her hand against the railing, it shifted under her weight. "George," she said quietly, not looking back, "tell me we didn't make a mistake." George joined her, studying the structure the way he once studied blueprints at the plant, patient, methodical. He crouched near the foundation. A crack ran along one side, but it wasn't catastrophic. The siding needed replacing. The roof would need patching. The porch might need rebuilding entirely. He stood and met her eyes. "We can fix walls," he said evenly. "We can't fix betrayal. This is easier." Dorothy searched his face for doubt. She didn't find any. The front door resisted before finally giving way with a long, reluctant groan. Inside, the cabin was dim and thick with the scent of dust and age. Light filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, casting thin beams across floating particles in the air. There was no furniture, no personal belongings, just emptiness. The floor creaked beneath every step. In one corner, a wood stove leaned slightly off-center. The kitchen area consisted of a rusted sink and warped cabinets, barely hanging onto the wall. Dorothy walked slowly through the space. "It's smaller than I thought." George nodded. "Less to heat." She smiled faintly despite herself. They opened every window they could pry loose. Fresh air began pushing out the stale silence. George located the breaker box. Dead. Utilities would have to wait. They decided to sleep in the truck the first night. The following morning, work began. They approached repairs the only way they knew how, carefully, together. George focused on structural issues first, reinforcing weak beams, clearing debris, measuring angles. Dorothy tackled cleaning, sweeping, scrubbing, opening space for possibility. They worked without complaint, without expectation. By afternoon, sunlight reached further into the cabin. It began to feel less abandoned and more patient. On the second day, George located the basement hatch beneath a thin sheet of plywood near the back wall. "Let's see how bad it is," he muttered. The basement steps creaked even louder than the floor above. A single pull-string bulb flickered weakly when he tested it with a portable generator he'd borrowed from a neighbor miles back down the road. The basement smelled different. Not just damp, sealed. The walls were unfinished concrete. Shelving units lined one side, mostly empty except for a few rusted jars and brittle cardboard boxes disintegrating with age. George ran his hand along the far wall. Something felt off. He tapped lightly with his knuckles. Solid. He moved a few feet over and tapped again. This time the sound shifted, subtle but distinct, hollow. He paused, tapped again. Dorothy looked up from a stack of collapsed crates. "What is it?" "Probably just air pockets," George said, though his voice had changed slightly. He moved a metal shelving unit aside. Behind it, partially hidden, was a small ventilation grate, older than the rest of the structure, painted over at least twice. "Why would there be ventilation behind a wall?" Dorothy asked quietly. George crouched, studying it. The screws were aged but intact. He removed one carefully. A faint current of cooler air brushed against his knuckles. He frowned. Later that afternoon, as they pulled away damaged insulation from a ceiling corner, Dorothy noticed something else. She held up a crumbling strip of newspaper. The paper was yellowed, but preserved between layers. George adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. The date read 1944. A wartime headline referenced troop movements in Europe. Dorothy's fingers tightened around the fragile strip. "That's not normal," she whispered. George didn't answer. The storm arrived 3 nights later. It rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the sky before sunset. Rain battered the roof in uneven rhythms. Wind forced its way through every crack and seam. They'd managed to set up a small sleeping area inside by then, mattress on the floor, battery lantern between them. The cabin groaned under pressure. Dorothy shifted closer to George as thunder shook the windows. Then, a sound. Dull. Heavy. From below. George's eyes opened immediately. "You heard that?" Dorothy asked. He nodded slowly. Another thud. Not wood shifting. Not wind. Something hitting from behind the basement wall. George grabbed the flashlight and made his way downstairs, the beam cutting through darkness. The storm above made every shadow seem alive. He approached the hollow section. Waited. Nothing. He tapped lightly. The sound echoed differently now. Clearer. He swallowed. Then he did something he hadn't done impulsively in decades. He swung the small sledgehammer he'd brought for repairs. The first strike cracked the surface. Dust filled the air. Dorothy appeared at the top of the stairs. "George!" Another strike. Concrete splintered. A third. A section gave way. Behind the wall was darkness. Not insulation. Not pipes. Space. George widened the opening carefully, heart pounding harder than it had in years. When the flashlight beam finally pierced through, Dorothy covered her mouth. It wasn't a crawl space, it was a room. Sealed. Preserved. Inside were wooden crates stacked neatly along the perimeter. Canvas-wrapped frames leaned upright against the far wall. The air inside felt undisturbed by time. George stepped through the opening. His shoes echoed faintly on a solid floor. He approached one of the wrapped canvases and gently peeled back a corner. Color exploded beneath the dust. Rich oils, intricate brushwork, signature in the corner. He didn't recognize the name, but he recognized value. Dorothy entered slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. On the nearest crate, faded lettering remained visible beneath grime. Museum für Kunst. The rest obscured. A wax seal remained intact along one edge. Another crate bore a different marking, French. There were dozens, carefully catalogued, protected. On a small desk in the corner sat a leather-bound ledger. George opened it cautiously. Inside, handwritten entries filled the pages. German script, dates from the early 1940s, inventory lists. Dorothy whispered the word neither of them wanted to say. War. George nodded slowly. They stood in silence, absorbing the magnitude. This wasn't forgotten storage. This was hidden, intentionally. Dorothy looked at the paintings again. Even in dim light, their quality was undeniable. "George," she said softly. He already knew. Even without knowing artists, without knowing provenance, without knowing exact numbers, he knew. This was worth more than anything they had ever owned. More than the house, more than the retirement, more than everything combined. His mind moved quickly despite himself. One painting, that's all it would take. Sell it quietly. Private collector. Anonymous transaction. They could buy a new home, travel, live comfortably. No one would know. The cabin had been condemned. The room undocumented. The paperwork incomplete. He felt the temptation like a physical weight. Dorothy's voice cut through it. "What if this is our second chance?" It wasn't greed in her tone. It was exhaustion. Years of sacrifice, of giving, of ending up with nothing. George closed the ledger slowly. He thought of the oak tree, of the eviction notice, of unanswered voicemails. He imagined explaining this choice to himself, to the version of him that had worked 35 years without cutting corners, to Dorothy, to the people they once were. The storm above intensified, rain striking the roof like impatient fingers. Dorothy's eyes searched his. "This could change everything," she whispered. George looked around the hidden chamber once more. Carefully wrapped paintings, museum stamps, wax seals unbroken for decades. This wasn't abandoned wealth. It was stolen history. He exhaled slowly. Then he did the hardest thing he'd done since losing the house. He stepped back through the broken wall, walked upstairs. Dorothy followed silently. George reached for his phone. His hand hovered over the contacts. He could call a broker. He could search for discreet buyers. He could make one quiet decision, and no one would ever trace it back. Instead, he opened the keypad, dialed 3 numbers. Dorothy's heart pounded in her ears as she listened. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered. "County Sheriff's Office." George's grip tightened slightly around the phone. He glanced at Dorothy one last time and spoke. The sheriff arrived first. 2 patrol cars rolled slowly up the dirt road just after sunrise, their tires carving fresh tracks into the damp earth. George stood on the porch, hat in hand, while Dorothy waited just inside the doorway. He had barely slept. Neither had she. Behind the broken basement wall lay a secret that no longer belonged to them. Within an hour, the quiet isolation of the cabin vanished. County deputies cordoned off the area. Yellow tape fluttered between trees like bright warnings against the green forest. A black SUV with state plates followed, then another. By mid-morning, vehicles George had never seen before lined the dirt road. Unmarked sedans, a van carrying equipment, a truck bearing the seal of a federal agency. The woods that had once felt forgotten now felt exposed. A forensic team documented everything: photographs, measurements, gloves, and evidence bags. The hidden chamber was sealed temporarily while specialists were called in. George and Dorothy were asked to wait outside. It was the waiting that felt longest. By noon, 2 art historians arrived, one from the State University, another flown in from Washington. Their reactions inside the chamber were immediate and unmistakable. George saw it in their faces as they emerged. Not curiosity, not confusion. Shock. "Do you have any idea what you found?" one of them asked, almost breathless. George shook his head. The historian removed his glasses slowly, as if buying time to choose words carefully. These works were reported missing during World War II. Several match descriptions from museum inventories that vanished during the Nazi occupation of Europe. Dorothy's hand tightened around George's. "Missing?" she repeated. "Looted," the historian clarified quietly. The ledger George had discovered confirmed it. Names, dates, shipment records, inventory codes from German-occupied territories. The hidden chamber had preserved a stolen collection untouched for over 70 years. By late afternoon, preliminary estimates circulated among officials. $10 million, possibly more. The number didn't feel real. George felt no triumph, only weight. The story spread before sunset. First local news vans arrived, their satellite dishes rising like metal mushrooms between the trees. Then regional reporters. By evening, national networks had picked up the headline, "Elderly couple discovers lost, we too art trove, reports it to authorities." Cameras captured images of the modest cabin, of George standing quietly beside Dorothy, of flashing patrol lights against the forest backdrop. Microphones were thrust forward. "Sir, why didn't you keep it?" "Ma'am, did you know what it was worth?" George answered simply. "It wasn't ours," Dorothy added. "History belongs where it belongs." The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Headlines called them heroes, commentators praised their honesty, social media flooded with admiration, but behind closed doors, praise gave way to scrutiny. 2 federal investigators requested a private conversation the following morning. They sat across from George and Dorothy at a folding table inside the cabin, notepads open, expressions neutral. "We need to establish a clear timeline," one began. "When exactly did you break through the wall? Did you remove any items from the chamber before contacting authorities? Did you attempt to identify or value the pieces prior to calling?" The questions were calm, precise, relentless. George answered each one steadily. No, they had not removed anything. Yes, they had opened one canvas to inspect it. Yes, they had read the ledger briefly. No, they had not contacted anyone else. Dorothy felt something she hadn't expected. Not guilt, not fear, but humiliation. After losing their home, after being abandoned, after choosing honesty when no one would have known otherwise, they were being examined as potential criminals. One investigator leaned forward slightly. "You understand," he said evenly. "It would not be unusual for someone in your situation to remove 1 or 2 pieces before reporting." George met his eyes. "We didn't." The man held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for a flicker of doubt. He found none. Still, they were interviewed twice more over the next week. Their bank records were reviewed, their call logs examined. Trust, George realized, was never assumed. It was tested. 2 weeks later, the announcement came. The federal government formally confirmed the collection's authenticity. Several paintings were traced to museums in France and Germany. Others matched records from private Jewish collectors whose estates had filed claims decades earlier. The recovery was described as one of the most significant residential discoveries of wartime looted art in recent history. Estimated value exceeding $10 million. Shortly after, an official statement followed. Due to federal recovery statutes and voluntary reporting, George and Dorothy would receive a legal reward of $2 million. $2 million. The number echoed differently this time. It wasn't temptation, it was validation. For the first time since the eviction, Dorothy allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, but from release. George simply closed his eyes for a long moment. Integrity had not cost them everything. It had changed everything. The calls began that evening. The first was from their eldest grandson. George stared at the name on his phone for several seconds before answering. "Grandpa," the voice began, strained and suddenly familiar. "We saw the news. We didn't know it was that bad." George said nothing. "We thought you were okay. You never said—" George listened. Apologies spilled out rapidly, layered with explanations and carefully placed guilt. "We've been meaning to call. It's just been so busy. We didn't realize about the house." Dorothy watched his face as he absorbed each word. He did not interrupt, he did not accuse, he did not comfort. After the call ended, another rang, then another, each grandchild one by one, different voices, same rhythm, shock, regret, subtle references to how proud they were, subtle reminders of shared history. The next day, they asked to visit. Dorothy hesitated. "They're still our family," she said quietly. George nodded. "Yes," he agreed. "They are." The grandchildren arrived together that weekend. 2 SUVs pulled into the clearing. Doors opened quickly. Familiar faces stepped out, older, sharper, more polished than the children who once ran through Maple Ridge Road. Dorothy's heart betrayed her first. She moved toward them instinctively. Hugs followed. Tears, voices layered over one another. "We're so sorry. We should have been there. We didn't know." George stood slightly back, observing. He noticed what hadn't changed. The way their eyes scanned the property, the way questions about the reward were woven casually into conversation. "So, $2 million. Is that before taxes? Are you staying here or upgrading? We could help you manage investments." Dorothy laughed softly at one comment, her old warmth resurfacing. For a moment, George saw the danger. Not of theft, but of erosion. Old patterns returning quietly. Later that afternoon, they all sat inside the partially renovated cabin. Sunlight streamed through newly unboarded windows. The room felt smaller with so many bodies in it. One granddaughter reached for Dorothy's hand. "We were just scared," she said. "We didn't know how to fix things." George spoke for the first time. "You could have started with a phone call." Silence settled. No one had an answer for that. Dorothy looked between them, the faces she had once kissed goodnight, now lined with adult uncertainty. Forgiveness rose easily in her, but something else rose in George. Clarity. That evening, as the grandchildren prepared to leave, George stepped onto the porch with them. "I forgive you," he said calmly. Relief washed over their expressions instantly. One grandson exhaled loudly. "Thank you, Grandpa." We just want things to go back to normal. George shook his head gently. No, he said. They frowned, confused. Forgiveness isn't access. The words landed without explanation. What do you mean? One asked. George looked at the forest behind them, then back at their faces. It means you're welcome in our lives, he said evenly, but not in our finances, not in our decisions, not in our stability. Dorothy stood in the doorway behind him, silent but steady. The grandchildren exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected tears, reunions, a restoration of comfort. They had not expected boundaries. George's voice remained calm. We helped because we wanted to, not because we owed you. That part is over. No anger, no raised tone, just finality. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying away the last of the afternoon heat. The grandchildren nodded slowly, still not fully understanding. They hugged Dorothy again before climbing into their vehicles. As engines started and tires turned back toward the main road, George remained on the porch. Dorothy stepped beside him. Do you think they'll understand? She asked softly. Eventually, George replied. In the distance, the taillights disappeared between the trees. The cabin stood quiet again, but it no longer felt hidden. It felt claimed. George placed his arm around Dorothy's shoulders. Forgiveness had been given. But something else had been established, and not everyone would accept it easily. Money changes people. That's what everyone says. But what George learned was quieter than that. Money doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you've already decided to be. The first thing George did after the reward was deposited was not buy a new truck. It was not browse real estate listings. It was not call a financial advisor recommended by a television host. He called an attorney. A modest office in town. Brick exterior. Coffee-stained carpet. A woman named Elaine Porter, who had built her career helping small business owners protect what they'd worked for. She listened carefully as George explained everything, from the eviction to the hidden room to the grandchildren's return. When he finished, she folded her hands. You don't want to lose control again, she said. George shook his head once. Not by accident. Within weeks, a trust was established. Assets were protected. Disbursements restricted. No loans. No informal transfers. No emotional withdrawals disguised as generosity. Dorothy read every page before signing. This time they understood exactly what they were protecting. Not just money. Stability. The cabin transformed slowly, not into a mansion, not into a showpiece for magazines, into a home. The porch was rebuilt first, solid cedar beams replacing the rotted boards. George insisted on doing much of the work himself, even when contractors offered help. Dorothy planted flowers along the edge of the clearing, wildflowers mostly, nothing too manicured. She wanted color that felt free. New windows replaced the boarded frames. Sunlight filled the rooms fully now. The cracked foundation was reinforced, the roof repaired. Inside, warm wood tones replaced peeling paint. They kept the footprints small. They kept the wood stove. They kept the simplicity. When a reporter once asked why they hadn't moved into something more fitting for their financial situation, Dorothy smiled gently. This fits, she said, and it did. The cabin no longer looked condemned. It looked intentional. The idea came from Dorothy. It was late one evening, the two of them sitting on the rebuilt porch watching the sky deepen into blue. I keep thinking about the day we stood on the sidewalk, she said quietly. George didn't respond right away. He remembered it too well. The way people looked at us, she continued, not cruel, just uncomfortable, like we had become a warning. George nodded slowly. There are others, she said, not because they were careless, not because they were foolish, just because they trusted. The next morning she began making calls. Within months the foundation was registered. They named it Second Ledger Foundation, because sometimes what matters most is the second record, the one written after loss. The mission was simple, to protect and restore dignity for seniors facing abandonment or financial exploitation. They started with 3 core programs: emergency housing grants, short-term financial support to prevent eviction while legal options were explored, legal protection assistance, partnerships with local attorneys to review refinancing agreements, co-signed loans, and questionable asset transfers, financial literacy workshops, free seminars for seniors on safeguarding retirement savings, understanding contracts, and recognizing emotional manipulation disguised as family obligation. The first workshop had 7 attendees. By the third month, they had 40. Letters began arriving, some handwritten in shaky script, some emailed by adult children trying to repair damage already done. George read each one carefully. He saw their own story repeated in different forms. Trust extended, resources drained, silence returned. But now there was intervention, there was awareness, there were boundaries. Media attention resurfaced when the Foundation's impact grew beyond the county. Interviews followed, articles, panel discussions. George never enjoyed the spotlight, but he understood its usefulness. If one person hears this and protects themselves, he told a reporter, it's worth the camera. Dorothy spoke more personally. Losing comfort isn't the same as losing worth, she said during one televised segment. We confuse generosity with obligation. That won't happen again. The grandchildren watched those interviews, and they adjusted their approach. They didn't ask directly for money anymore. That would have been too obvious. Instead, invitations increased, holiday dinners, birthday parties. Just come spend time with us. George accepted some, declined others. When they visited the cabin, they were welcomed. Meals were shared, stories exchanged. But subtle tests emerged. One grandson mentioned a business expansion. Another referenced rising rent costs. A granddaughter casually asked about how the trust works. George answered calmly. We're comfortable, he would say. Nothing more. One afternoon during a family barbecue, the eldest grandson lingered after the others left. He shifted his weight, clearly rehearsing something. I've been thinking, he began. Maybe I could help manage some of the Foundation investments. I took a finance course last year. George met his eyes evenly. That's kind of you, he replied. But we already have professionals. The grandson hesitated. I just thought, it could keep it in the family. George's tone never sharpened. It is in the family, he said. Dorothy and I are still here. The conversation ended there, not explosively, not dramatically, but definitively. Visits continued, but the undercurrent changed. They were no longer the open well. They were hosts with boundaries. One evening, long after the guests had gone and the dishes were drying inside, Dorothy sat quietly beside George on the porch. The forest hummed with crickets. Fireflies flickered between trees. I used to think losing the house meant we'd failed, she admitted softly. George turned slightly toward her. I thought dignity came from what we built, she continued, from what we provided. She looked at the cabin, the solid beams, the warm light glowing through the windows. But losing everything showed me something, she said. Dignity isn't in the walls, it's in the choice. George nodded. We could have taken one painting, she said. No one would have known. But we would have, he replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm glad we didn't. So was he, because the treasure had never really been the art. It wasn't the $10 million worth of stolen history. It wasn't the $2 million reward. It wasn't the quiet vindication of watching headlines call them honorable. It was that moment in the storm, when the wall had fallen open, when temptation had stood quietly in the room, when no one was watching. And they chose integrity anyway. The cabin no longer felt like a bargain purchase. It felt earned, not by luck, not by discovery, but by restraint, by clarity, by limits. On the anniversary of the day they lost the house on Maple Ridge Road, George planted a young oak tree at the edge of their property. Dorothy watched him press the soil firmly around its base. Starting over again, she teased gently. No, he said, brushing dirt from his hands. Starting forward. The tree stood small against the vast forest, but it would grow. Roots deepen quietly before anyone sees the strength above ground. As dusk settled, they returned to the porch. The cabin lights glowed warm against the darkening woods. There were no reporters, no flashing cameras, no applause, just 2 chairs, 2 steady hands resting side by side. They had lost a house, they had lost illusions, they had lost the comfort of being needed. But they had gained something far rarer. They had gained proof. That character does not disappear when circumstances collapse. It clarifies. And in the quiet of the woods, beneath a sky untouched by headlines or history, the cabin stood not as a lucky purchase, but as a monument to who they had chosen to be.